The perpetrator of this crime had worked as a sheriff's deputy, which meant he knew what it was like not only to have the authority over other people, but he knew exactly what people would be prepared to do if you showed them you had a badge. He would later go on to use that badge to lure his victims into a place where there was no escape. This is REDRUM, stories about the true victims of crime. I use news archives, documentary footage and books to research these cases, and so the episodes are accurate to the source material I can find. You can find all episodes in podcast or YouTube form in the description box down below. You can get ad-free early releases on Patreon, where you can support REDRUM to keep happening from just a couple of quid a month. Thank you. I'm going to start this episode with a quote from one of the killers. Fair warning, it's pretty gruesome and we're going to get straight into it. This quote comes from the man David Alan Gore. I think his last name, Gore, is pretty appropriate here. Quote, "For years I abducted, raped and tortured and killed women right in my hometown and no one ever suspected me. I learned how crimes were investigated, what cops looked for, and I honed my skills to a science." It was a warm morning in July 1981 that Judith Daley got her 2 teenage daughters ready and into her car. She was currently living in California with her family, but she'd returned to her hometown just a few miles south of Vero Beach. She was there just for the summer, and that morning she dropped her 2 daughters off at the nearby Vero Beach, and then she headed out a little further, a couple of miles further on, so that she could go to an area that was a little bit quieter, get her beach chair out, get her book out, and spend a couple of hours there. She gave her daughters the instructions that she would be back soon, and when she arrived at her new spot, she spent a few hours there before deciding that it was probably time to go back and pick her daughters up. But as she started her car, she could tell something was wrong. It wouldn't start. By some incredible coincidence, at that exact moment, an officer walked towards the car and asked what was going on and if he could help. Judith told him what had happened and said she didn't know why her car wasn't starting, but that she might need a mechanic. The officer said he could drive her to a nearby payphone where she could call for help, and Judith agreed, getting into the officer's car and driving off into the distance. But Judith was never seen alive again. It turned out the officer that had helped Judith had been lying in wait for her. He knew that her car wouldn't start because he'd made sure of it. He had planned this, and the plan was working perfectly. The man's name was David Alan Gore, and Judith was by no means his first victim, and she certainly wasn't going to be his last. It's difficult to know exactly when David's perverted and shocking behaviour started, but what we do know is that the earliest example of this, or one of the earliest examples of this, was when he worked as a teenager at a local petrol station or gas station. He had decided to make a tiny hole in one of the bathroom walls of the men's toilets. That hole gave direct viewing access through to the women's bathrooms. There's no way to know how long exactly this went on for, but what we do know is that it only stopped because David's boss found out and quickly fired him. David wasn't too bothered though. He had more important things to focus on. He'd always been close with his friend and cousin, Fred Waterfield. Fred was just a year older than him, and the close age gap meant that they'd always been close and they'd always talked about what was in their minds. As they got older, into their teenage years, they realised that they both had a desire to hurt women. They spent their days talking about just what they wanted to do to the women, specifically things like sexually assault them. And spurred on by one another, it wasn't long before they started trying. Their first victim was Fred's younger cousin, Wendy, who was also David's younger sister. They both plotted together, and eventually, with David's help, Fred sexually assaulted Wendy. And in fact, David actually held her down as this was happening. Their teenage years continued, with both of the boys cooking up what horrific events they wanted to do to their unknowing victims. But when David was 21, he met and married a woman called Donna, and they had a baby boy together. And alongside that, Fred also married a woman called Donna, and they had twins together. But becoming fathers definitely didn't give them any kind of sense of morals or slow down their sadistic fantasies. They decided they still wanted to act on them. And so in 1976, 3 years after the birth of Fred's children, they did. 27-year-old Diane Sullivan Smalley was driving down a road on her way to Lake Wales when she heard some loud pops. She wasn't sure what they were, but she felt her car sort of veering off to one side, and so she realised that she must have a flat tyre, possibly 2 flat tyres. So she pulled over to the side of the road, got out of her car and started to have a look and investigate what exactly had happened. What Diane didn't know was that David and Fred had seen her on her own driving along, and they honed in on her as their next victim. They'd been following Diane for a couple of minutes when one of the men leaned out of the car and pointed his rifle at Diane's car. He quickly shot a number of rounds, and none of the bullets actually hit Diane, but that was never where he was aiming for. He'd been aiming for the tyres, and he got them. The men watched as Diane pulled over, and they pulled over next to her, and they got out of the car and asked if she needed any help. But before she could even answer them, Diane felt a gun in her ribs, and she realised that David was pointing it at her, and he demanded that she get in the back seat of their car, and so she did. She didn't know what else to do. But as soon as she got in, she realised she needed to get out right now or she might not make it out at all. She then clocked some headlights of another car coming down the road towards her, and so she opened the back door and bolted out and into the path of that other car. The couple driving immediately stopped their car and let Diane get inside. But David and Fred were too scared that they wouldn't be able to sort of take on 3 people. They'd only planned to take on 1 woman. Now there was a woman, a man and another woman. And so they just sort of sped off into the distance. But for them, this was just the beginning. And next time would be much more successful for them. In July of 1976, 20-year-old Angela Hummel left her house. She got into her car and she was getting ready for her drive to work. Now, as she was about to leave, she realised that her car felt odd and she actually had 2 flat tyres. It was curious that she had 2 flats at the same time, having seemingly come from nowhere, but Angela didn't really worry herself with how that had happened. Right now, her main concern was being able to get to work on time. Her ex-husband, Bob, had previously recommended a mechanic called Fred. Of course, Fred is the man that we know as Fred Waterfield. Fred arrived at Angela's place and he told her to get into the car. He said he'd take her to work first and then he'd come back and fix her car so it was ready for the evening. Now, because she knew Fred through her ex-husband, she wasn't in the slightest bit afraid or suspicious of him, and so she got straight into his car. But when he took a detour into the orange groves, she asked what he was doing, and he said that he knew this shortcut to Angela's work, and as she was already running late because of her car troubles, he was going to make sure she got there on time, and this was the only way to do it. But as they turned a corner, Fred actually drove into a ditch and the car became stuck and they couldn't go on. So Fred got out of the car and he told Angela to stay put. He said his cousin David lived nearby and he'd go and get him, he'd help them get the car out of the ditch and then they'd continue on to work. But when Fred returned with David close behind, she would later say that she saw they had these kind of evil smirks on their faces. And that's when Fred reached over into the glove box and pulled out a gun. They both then raped Angela, with the other holding the gun to her head. And then David got a knife out and pressed it to the skin of her neck. He said he was going to cut her up and feed her to the alligators. But for some reason, something that Angela still doesn't know the reason for to this day, that is when they decided that actually, if she agreed that she would never tell anyone what happened, they would drop her back at her home, they wouldn't kill her, they would let her go, and they did exactly that. But Angela went straight to the hospital, she had her injuries checked out, and then she reported the rape. She knew both the perpetrators by name, and so they were brought in for questioning straight away. But both David and Fred said that although yes, they had had sex with Angela, they insisted it was consensual. And in a sadly unsurprising but extremely frustrating series of events, Angela was not believed. They even got her to do a polygraph test, something we know is highly unreliable. But when it came back, the officer told Angela to her face that she was lying, and if she decided to pursue this line, then she would be prosecuted, or she could be prosecuted for perjury. Because of this, the investigation never went any further, and both the men were free to leave. If this case had been properly investigated at the time, then the officers would likely have gone to Angela's vehicle and they would have found that those car tyres that had these 2 coincidental punctures, they would have found that they had actually been intentionally slashed. I mentioned earlier that one of these men used his sheriff's deputy badge to lure his victims. This was David. He got this job in his hometown, but as it was as an auxiliary sheriff's deputy, he actually had no right to pull anyone over and get them to come with him unless he was accompanied by an officer. Fred told David that for every attractive woman he managed to lure using his badge, he would pay David up to $1,000. And it does seem as though David was sort of answering to Fred, although he's very much an active and willing participant, oftentimes going out on his own to search for women and girls. He clearly wants to impress his older cousin, who is just a year older than him, but also he's very clearly just keen to exert his power over younger, vulnerable women and girls. It was on the 19th of February 1981 that David marched up to a school bus that was just pulling in to drop students off. One teenager, Ying Hua Ling, who was an award-winning maths student at Vero Beach High School, she was walking off the school bus and began to walk down the road to her house. But that's when David struck. He'd been stalking Ying for a number of weeks and he knew her routine. He showed Ying his badge and said she needed to come with him. This is the 1980s, and there's this older man showing her his official badge, and of course she obliged. She didn't know of any other way to respond to this situation. And so she got into David's car, and he drove down the road and towards her house. At this point, Ying's worst worry was probably that she was going to have to explain to her parents exactly what was happening and why she was in trouble. But she didn't even know. David hadn't explained this to her. He hadn't come up with any kind of story. And so after David had pulled over, he got out of the car, knocked on the door and waited for it to open. Ying's mother, Hsiang, answered, and when David asked her to come and get in his car, she did. David explained that her daughter was in some kind of trouble and he needed to talk to them both together. But as soon as Ying's mother, Hsiang, was in the car, David raced towards that isolated citrus grove where he worked. He abducted the mother and daughter and he made sure to handcuff them together so there was no chance of escape. He parked up and he dragged Ying and Hsiang out of his vehicle and towards an area of this grove. And then he called Fred. Now Fred was working in Orlando and he said he was going to finish up and he'd head down and be there as soon as possible. Meanwhile, back at Ying's family home, her brother had returned home from school and he'd walked up to the house and immediately knew something was wrong. He was confused because the front door was open, and as he walked inside, he realised that no one was home. He alerted the police, but there wasn't a whole lot for them to go on. No one had seen anything suspicious, and although that front door had been open, there were no other signs of any kind of anything out of the ordinary or any distress. Meanwhile, across town, Fred had arrived to where David was holding Ying and Hsiang, and once he arrived, he confirmed to David that he'd done a very good job, and then he agreed to pay him $400 for each of the women. 48-year-old Hsiang and 17-year-old Ying were worth a grand total of $800. And as a gesture of goodwill, Fred said that on top of paying this $800 total payment, he would also allow David to sexually assault the women. David and Fred tied the two women to a tree before they both raped Ying, and then David did the same to Hsiang. Fred decided he didn't want to do that to Hsiang because he didn't like how old she was. He liked his victims young. In the end, though, it turned out that he and David had tied Hsiang so tightly to this tree, it had restricted her breathing, and she ended up choking to death. Now, I couldn't find out the specifics in terms of the way that they killed Ying, but either way, she did die. She was murdered. Both the women were now dead, and they had to decide what to do with the bodies. But they already had a plan for that. They began disposing them. They had these oil drums, and so they dismembered them and then put those various dismembered body parts in the drums. Then they buried them, and then they just left the scene. The cousins kept in contact for the next few months, promising each other that they would do this all over again sometime soon. And in July of that same year, David found his next victim. As we know, he'd been spending the last few months working as an auxiliary sheriff's deputy, and now he knew just how well that badge would work in terms of how much power it could give him and authority it could get him. He'd been using his night shifts to sort of scope out the area and eye up his next victims. And that is when he honed in on 35-year-old Judith Daley. Judith is the woman who he started the story with. So the woman who went and dropped her 2 teenage daughters off and then couldn't get her car to start. So we know that as she was at the area of the beach that she'd settled down on, she was reading her book. What Judith didn't know at this time was that David had seen her, he was watching her, and he decided that she was going to be his next victim. And so he silently snuck up to her car and somehow managed to tamper with it so that she wouldn't be able to drive on. When Judith eventually went back to her car and realised it wouldn't start up, she was probably relieved to see this officer flashing his badge, walking towards her to help her. David said that he could drive her to a payphone, and of course she agreed, ever so thankful that he'd just happened to be there at the right time. But as soon as she got into his car, David pulled out his gun and put the handcuffs on her. He then drove to a secluded area he'd scoped out earlier and he met up with Fred. Fred paid David $1,500 for the abduction of Judith. The two men then both raped Judith before they killed her. In fact, it was David who killed her by strangulation. They decided that the easiest way to get rid of the body was to dump it in this swamp area that was close by, and in their minds, the alligators would then have her remains. And oddly, this is when David decided to call Judith's family and say that she was having car trouble so she wouldn't be able to pick the girls up from the beach. I really couldn't work out why he did this other than to perhaps stall for a little bit of time. Even so, it seems wild to sort of insert yourself into the case like this, but we do see this happen again and again. We see people insert themselves into the case just so that they can be close to the investigation and sort of see what's going on. Either way, when Judith didn't return later on that evening, they did call police, and it seems as though police acted quite quickly. They had a sighting of David Gore with blood on him in the last place that Judith was seen. And they also managed to track down her car, which on closer inspection, they saw that the coil wire had been pulled, and it was evident that this was an intentional tampering. After that, they questioned David, but he made up some story about the reason he was there was to check the tides. Of course, this didn't really make a lot of sense, and so the police managed to get a warrant to search his house and also his vehicle. And in that vehicle, they found 2 hairs caught in the radio holder that when they then checked them in a comparison to 2 hairs found on Judith's hairbrush, they found that they were a match. However, without a body or any more evidence, the investigating officer was told that there was nothing else they could do. Especially after David lawyered up, what they actually had to do was just let him go. It was less than 1 week after the murder of Judith that David wanted to kill again. This time, he had his sights set on an 18-year-old girl called Dana. He walked up to her and said that he needed to ask her a few questions about a recent burglary. In fact, he said that there had been someone there who had identified her as being involved. She seemed unsure, but when he showed her his badge, Dana thought she had no choice but to go with him. And so she followed David into this sort of abandoned area, but thankfully there were some fishermen nearby, and this for some reason caused David to panic, and he just told Dana to go on home. And when Dana got home, she told her parents what had happened, and her dad was immediately suspicious, so much so that he filed a police complaint, and they ended up managing to realise that it was David. They tracked him down, they brought him in, they ended up firing him and confiscating his badge. That badge was the only way that he'd ever had success in managing to abduct his previous victims. Without it, he was worried that he wouldn't be able to go on with doing what he'd done, and so he needed to come up with a different plan of action. This time, he decided he was going to use the method of surprise to get his victims. He knew that there were people in his area, mostly, who would leave their cars unlocked, and so he decided he was going to wait until a woman left her car, leaving it unlocked. He was going to get into the back seat and lie in wait. Once the woman returned, he would use his gun to make her do whatever he wanted. And of course, he still had the handcuffs, so he would plan to render her helpless as soon as he possibly could. And he put his plan into action soon after. A young woman called Marilyn Owens was just finishing up a doctor's appointment, and she began walking back to her car through the car park. And she glanced backwards to the back seat of her car, and that's when she saw someone inside. She could just make out that there was a black figure there, and so she started screaming. And it just so happened that at the exact moment, a police officer was coming out of the doctor's surgery as well. That police officer heard the woman's screams and ran towards her. The officer looked into the back and saw David there, and he also saw that he had handcuffs, he had that gun, and he had a police scanner. The officer would also later say that David seemed a bit drunk. When he asked David what he was doing, he didn't have any excuse that the officer believed, and so they brought him in for questioning. Eventually, he was charged with armed trespassing. And because this event had happened just days after the event with the teenager and her dad filing a complaint and him getting fired, because this was so close together, he actually was sentenced to 5 years. He did end up serving less than half that 5-year sentence though, and he was released in March of 1983 on parole. And his time in prison had done nothing to help him sort of reflect on what he'd done. He had been offered psychiatric assessment and therapy, but he'd refused to take them up on that. And in fact, he came out of prison seemingly more determined than ever to continue with his brutal and sadistic ways. It was less than 2 months later that David was driving down a road in Vero Beach when he came across a sex worker looking for clients. David picked her up, but the woman could just sort of sense something was wrong. She'd been working the streets for a while, and she really did trust her gut instinct. She managed to force her way out of his car before running away. And there were many more escapes or examples of escapes from women who had been abducted or nearly abducted by David. One woman's car had broken down and she'd been taken by David, and he later admitted that he had tied her down, shaved off her pubic hair, and then kept it as a trophy. It was after that Fred joined David on the next killing mission. It was on the 20th of May 1983 that David set out driving again down Vero Beach, and this time he came across 2 young teenagers hitchhiking for a ride. Angelica LaVallee, also known as Angel, and Barbara Ann Byer, also known as Barbie, were both just 14 years old, and they were both looking for a ride. It was extremely concerning to Barbie's parents when she didn't return home that afternoon. What they didn't find out for another 4 months was that Barbie and Angel had gotten into the backseat of David's vehicle. He and Fred had seen the 2 teenagers hitchhiking and saw it as the perfect opportunity. David immediately pointed his gun at the girls and handcuffed them. Fred told David to take the wheel, and he climbed into the back where he sexually assaulted both of them. Eventually, Fred joined in. This went on for hours until eventually David raised his gun and he shot both the girls callously in the back of the head. As was becoming quite a tradition by this point, David then dismembered the bodies before they drove them to dump them in various areas of Vero Beach, including a canal. It was 2 months after that Fred and David decided to look for their next and final victims. They again picked up 2 teenagers who were travelling north up to a different beach, 16-year-old Lynn Eliott and 14-year-old Regan Martin. The pair had never hitchhiked before. In fact, on this particular day, they'd actually been planning to get a ride with one of their friends, but at the very last minute, they decided that they were going to hitchhike instead. Lynn's dad would later say that if he'd have known they were planning to hitchhike, he would never have let them gone, but, quote, "Kids are really trusting." David grabbed the gun and pointed it at the girls, and at first they thought that this was a joke, but David quickly told them that he was deadly serious. After David and Fred handcuffed the girls and they were headed back down the street towards David's parents' house, Fred looked out of the driver's side window and he saw his sister. We don't know why for sure, but for some reason, probably panic, Fred decided that he just didn't want to be involved with this right now. He instead decided to go home and he left David with Lynn and Regan. David took them both back to his family home and he tied them up in different rooms and he sexually assaulted them. But as David was sexually assaulting Regan, he was obviously in a different room to Lynn, and Lynn saw this as her opportunity. She saw it as her only chance to escape, and so she did actually manage to break free from her restraints, which were tied incredibly tightly, but now she had to get out of the house. She pelted forwards towards the front door, and she did actually manage to open it and get outside. She had seen freedom. All she needed to do now was find someone, flag down a passerby, or get to another house. But David had heard the front door open, and so he was running at full speed out of the house and towards her. And Lynn wasn't wearing any shoes, so she was barefoot on this sort of rocky driveway, desperately trying to make it just a few more steps, a few more strides ahead. She didn't get much further though. David was upon her. He raised the gun, and he frantically pulled the trigger twice, shooting Lynn in the back of the head. She slumped to the floor, dead, and David then dragged her body towards his car, opened up the boot or the trunk of the car, and threw her inside. Now, this whole thing had happened incredibly unexpectedly, and it was in the middle of the day. What David hadn't counted on was that there was a teenage boy who just happened to be riding his bike past at the same time as David shot Lynn. The boy had seen everything. He darted back towards his house, and he told his parents, who at first didn't really believe him. They thought he must be mistaken. But when they went outside, they could see that there was a pool of blood on the grassy patch in front of David's house. And so they made a 911 call and reported that this had happened. Now, at the same time, David, sensing that, of course, this boy had seen and he probably was going to go and call the police, or at the very least tell someone, David decided to also call 911 and say that he had seen a man chasing a girl down the street. But when asked for his address, he gave an address a couple of blocks away. But dispatch could see that this call had come from David's house. And so police, who were already on their way there, continued, and they arrived outside in a matter of minutes. As they were waiting outside, one of the officers spotted David's car just on the driveway, and that same officer saw that there was a small pool of blood underneath it. He looked to see where the blood was coming from, and it was clear that it was actively dripping from the boot or the trunk. As they popped it open, they found Lynn's lifeless body. She had clearly suffered gunshot wounds to the head. The police tried to call David out to get him to surrender. They knew he was armed, and at this point, they didn't know that there was another person inside being held hostage or possibly dead. And so they began a standoff that lasted over an hour and a half. Eventually, the police decided they had no choice but to raid the house, and so they pushed their way inside. David surrendered, and he was taken into police custody. But of course, the police then went on to search the rest of the house, and once they got upstairs into the attic, they found Regan. She was lying naked, and she'd been tied up with some electrical cords, which had also been tied to the beams of the attic space. But Regan was alive. David knew that once he'd been caught, there was no way he was going to get out of what he had done. And because of this, he told police a lot. He even gave up his cousin Fred. And because police had details of some previous claims against them, the two of them together, specifically for that rape that had happened to Angela, they did believe him, or they certainly gave some credibility to the story that he and Fred had done this together. David even admitted that he and Fred had been in the process of buying a house together in the middle of nowhere. You couldn't see the house from the road because it was so set back in the woods. He admitted that they'd planned to use it as a lair, and that they would continue hunting down girls and women and taking them there to rape and murder them. Oh, and get this, David had a really solid reason for doing all of these brutal, horrific killings. He blamed his ex-wife, who had left him and taken his two sons. He said that because of this, he'd built up such an anger and resentment towards women, and he had vented that through murder. David even admitted to killing his ex-wife's sister, Joanne. He had murdered her, quote, then skinned her like a deer before cutting her up and burying the pieces. Something we know he then went on to do in most of his subsequent murders. Police quickly arrested Fred and brought him in for questioning. And thankfully, they didn't really need him to be super cooperative because David had already given them so much information. David had told them about the other girls that the pair had raped and abducted and killed, and even took them to different places that they buried their remains. It would turn out that the only reason David gave up his cousin Fred and gave so much detail on the crimes was because he was offered a plea deal. If he told police about all of the different crimes, including disclosing the various locations of the victims' bodies, and if he agreed to testify against Fred at trial, then the death penalty would be off the table. The authorities did manage to find some of the women's remains, including Hsiang and Ying, the mother and daughter, and Barbara or Barbie Byer, the 14-year-old hitchhiker. Many of the other women and girls' remains were not found due to them having been dumped in canals and lakes where alligators presumably ended up eating their remains. The case went to trial, and David had been found guilty, and he had obviously taken this plea deal, but he was actually found to be an unreliable witness, i.e. he had been lying about certain aspects, and so his plea deal was revoked because of this, and so he was actually given the death penalty. He was executed by lethal injection in 2012. Fred, however, completely denied that the things had happened in the way that David had said. He wouldn't give any additional information, and he kept up his story that he had very little to do with any of the murders. And for that reason, it actually wasn't possible to charge him with the same crimes as David or the same counts. And Fred was actually only ever able to be convicted of the murders of Angel and Barbie. The Angel conviction is a little surprising to me because they never actually found her body, but I suppose they did find some of Barbie's remains, and the fact they went missing together and they knew the brothers were with them, I suppose that might have led to that conviction. Fred was given a life sentence. David only ever showed remorse for his crimes when he was attempting to appeal his death sentence. He said he'd found God and become a Christian, and that he wanted to apologise to his victims' families, but his behaviour in prison really did not align with this, and I think showed his true colours. He spoke to other inmates about just how much he enjoyed the killings and how he still thought about it all the time. He also struck up a pen pal relationship with a woman in England called Ada. She said that although David had admitted to 6 murders, he told her he'd actually killed over 30 people. He specified that he knew how to get rid of evidence because of his police training. But he wouldn't disclose any of the victims' names or any of their details, saying that he just couldn't remember anything. It's kind of impossible to know how much of what David said was true, but what's clear is that he really believed that he was not only above the law, but also that the people he killed did not deserve any kind of mercy. Of all the cases that I've covered here on REDRUM, I think David is up there with the least remorseful of them all. Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of REDRUM. As always, if you've got a case suggestion, pop it in the box down below. I'm also always looking for horror film recommendations, especially at the minute, British horrors I'm really into. I've got like a list of probably 50 that I'm working to get through. But do let me know if you've seen any that are exciting or really good, and I'll pop them to the top of my list. Other than that, I will see you next week for another episode of REDRUM. Bye.